You can't go anywhere in the world without seeing somebody in blue jeans. Nowhere. Nowhere in the world can you go without seeing somebody in blue jeans. White Oak was the world's largest denim mill for an awful long time.
The Cone Mills became the largest producer of denim in the world and the primary denim supplier for the famous Levi Strauss jeans.
The Cone name is everywhere in Greensboro. You know, there's the Cone Hospital, the YMCA, the Art Museum, and etc. And I'm not sure that people fully understand the meaning of that legacy. And for sure, I don't think they recognize that the role of the workers who made Cone what it is. And this is a history that's within living memory. These were the people who did the work that drove this economy for almost a century around here.
Listen to the heartbeat of a great industry. Textile making has been an accompanying sound effect to all of American history. For this nation's first manufactured product was cloth, our first and therefore our oldest industry. And behind this versatile array of beauty and service stand 1.25 million Americans, the heart of the textile industry, one of the nation's largest employers.
Both my parents worked there at White Oak. My father worked in the weave room for 40-some years. He's a loom fixer. My mother worked there in the finishing department for 30-some years.
And your grandfather?
And my grandfather and grandmother and aunts and uncles, all my people worked at White Oak.
That's all they knew. I mean, that was what they knew, because when they started these jobs, there were no jobs. Cone brought jobs to these, and they built these villages for these people.
The Cone started a family textile company in Greensboro, North Carolina, that expanded to 21 plants among 12 communities in the South and employed tens of thousands of workers.
As a historian, you look back at an individual or a family like the Cones, and certainly they're talented and they're successful at what they do, and their decisions mattered. But at the same time, they lived in a historical context. You know, there's a lot of smart people. There's a lot of hard-working people. But not all smart, hard-working people are going to be able to have the advantages to make it to a successful level. And in the New South, it really had a lot to do with whether or not you had access to credit, whether or not you had an opportunity to work with other business people, whether or not you had connections outside of the region. If you didn't have these things, you wouldn't be a successful industrialist.
In 1846, at the age of 17, the Cone patriarch, Hermann Cone, immigrates to America, seeking better opportunities. He left his merchant family in Bavaria to escape rising anti-Semitic hostilities. Hermann Americanized his last name to Cone. The Cone family would go from immigrant to industrialist status in 2 generations.
My grandfather, he was a young German Jew who was sent over here by his older sisters and their husbands who financed his journey.
Hermann's brother-in-law, Joseph Rosengart, wrote a letter advising Hermann how to conduct himself in the New World. You may shed tears because you are leaving your parents' house and your native land, but dry your tears, because you may have the sweet hope of finding a second home abroad and a new country, and where the Jew is not excluded from the society of all other men. Hermann arrived in the New World with very little money, but he possessed trade experience in merchandising and peddling from working in his father's retail business. He joined his 2 sisters that had already established themselves in Richmond, Virginia.
He evidently came from a very good background. He had at that day and time a little better education, I guess, than most young Germans had.
According to family lore, Hermann's sister and brother-in-law strongly encouraged him to leave Richmond because of his thick immigrant accent and old world ways which were an embarrassment within their social circles. Hermann set off to establish a merchant business with another recent Bavarian immigrant, Jacob Adler, his future brother-in-law.
Did open a store in a little town outside of Richmond, Lewisburg, Virginia, for a while. But it didn't succeed, and they ended up moving back with the relatives in Richmond for a time. And they got a second chance by having the relatives again set them up with some goods and starting them out again, heading west. This time they journeyed a little farther into Jonesboro, Tennessee.
Cone and Adler came to a well-established town. However, it was still a frontier town. There were a fairly significant Pennsylvania Dutch population. So Cone and Adler came to a place where folks spoke German. They are also considered to be Jonesboro's first Jewish population. They did set up shop, they did have a bricks and mortar location, but they only kept it open 2 weeks out of the month. They alternated weeks, so 1 week they would have the store open in Jonesboro and be in there. The other week, they'd close the store, fill up their wagon, and take the goods out into the county directly to the people. And I think that did a couple of things for them. I think, first of all, it got them meeting this Pennsylvania Dutch population. But the other thing it did is, you know, if you only get into town once a month to shop, you're going to shop with the guy who takes his time to bring you stuff the other times.
One of the things that they innovated, and I think that made their store soon become the most successful in Jonesboro, was the idea of ready-made wear. Someone can go in and actually purchase a suit or a dress and take it out and wear it that day. They didn't have to go home and make it.
Cone and Adler quickly established themselves as leading citizens in town. Adler and his family actually in 1860 purchased one of Jonesboro's finest homes.
While living in Jonesboro, Hermann marries Helen Guggenheim, a merchant's daughter from Natural Bridge, Virginia. Helen was also born around Bavaria. The majority of the Cone children were born in Jonesboro. The last two children born in Jonesboro were sisters Etta and Clarabelle, who would grow up to become pioneers in the modern art world.
Moses and Caesar were born in 1857 and 1859, respectively, in Jonesboro. They grew up in a merchant's household where everybody's expected to pitch in. You start working at an early age. So in addition to whatever schooling they were getting, they also got a business schooling from their father and their uncle. And I think there they learned a lot of the business skills that they were going to apply as adults in later life.
Cone and Adler closed their shop. They got rid of their inventory, purchased adjoining farms, and actually in 1863 were still purchasing slaves to help on their farm.
Many Jews in the South were influenced more by their location than by their ethnicity when declaring allegiance during the Civil War. Both Cone and Adler were Confederate sympathizers, and Hermann belonged to a local Confederate militia.
There were many Confederate businessmen and Confederate sympathizers who were quite literally escorted to the train at gunpoint and told to leave town, and were given a moment's notice to do it. Cone and Adler, who both were Confederate sympathizers, although they didn't sell their farms right away, they reopened their store. But they reopened it with a third business party, a gentleman by the name of Shipley. And Mr. Shipley not only was a staunch, loyal Union man all throughout the war, but he had recently been elected as the Washington County Sheriff. So they had both the legal and the politics on their side with their new store.
So after the war, those yeoman farmers who had gone off to battle came home, and they had to try to reestablish themselves on the land. And in order to do that, they were in desperate need of credit. And so they turned for loans to the local crossroads merchant. Credit was scarce, and so those merchants often charged interest rates as high as 50 to 75%.
Cone and Adler. They opened their new store. They expanded their merchandise from not just household but farm implements and things of that nature. They started bartering for liens. So you could actually go into that store with your title to your property and get what you needed, and they would hold title until you paid off your credit. And if you didn't, then they would foreclose on you rather quickly. And they did foreclose on a number of pieces of property, including the home of A.E. Jackson, Washington County's only general, and he was a Confederate general.
In 1870, Hermann and Helen moved their family from Jonesboro, Tennessee to Baltimore, Maryland.
His children were getting old enough. He wanted to give them better educational opportunities. And also, there was no synagogue in Jonesboro around here, so I think they wanted to be back where there was a synagogue and a much larger Jewish population. And realizing that the post-war economic situation is going to be different, and it's going to be more favorable to be in the wholesale side of the business than the resale side. And it just so happens his brother-in-law in Baltimore was in the wholesale side.
Really, this is an up-and-coming area for middle-class German Jews. Wanting to make sure that your kids marry other Jews, you need to be in a spot where that can, where they can be introduced to each other. And so there are two large synagogues right there in Utah Place.
Well, Moses and Bertha, they start dating in 1884, and it's likely that they met at some social event.
They're both families are kind of the same type. Parents have come over from Germany. Their parents have been making their money through dry goods business. So I think there's just a lot of commonality there. And so it doesn't surprise me that they met and that she might have first dated Caesar and then later met Moses.
She's a bit older. The family joke that I've heard is after he proposes to Bertha, says, "I'm saving you from being a spinster," and she says it's too late.
They seemed like they had a very good partnership. I think they were both smart and they were both ambitious.
Hermann and his sons Moses and Caesar traveled widely across the eastern coast selling for H. Cone & Sons.
A lot of my grandfather's customers, cotton mill commissary stores, at times when money was tight, he wasn't able to collect cash for his groceries. He would frequently have to take yarn or cloth in trade for his coffee and his sugar and his tobacco products. Through that connection, he got to know a good many of the early textile pioneers in the South.
When Moses and Caesar's father and uncle retired, and that's when they started getting into the textiles side of things.
Our people got started first in the commission house business, starting a Cone Export and Commission Company in 1890 in New York. Well, the capital for the Cone Export and Commission Company was provided the liquidation of my grandfather's wholesale grocery business. Plus, had made contracts with the southern mills, which up to that time had not been represented in the New York national markets or international markets. Of course, the goods were not very good quality. They were cheap in comparison with the eastern goods made in New England. And it was a very successful venture, however. And at that time, it was called the Plaid Trust. The original Cone Export and Commission Company was called the Plaid Trust because most of these small southern mills were involved in making plaids, what they call Southern plaids. But at one time, that company had a sales contract with almost every mill in the South. Some 40-odd small Southern textile mills.
Textile mills were returning a good profit at the time. Even the poorest managed mills were returning over 20% in dividends.
Moses Cone's first investment, serious investment in textiles, is in 1887. He makes a $50,000 investment in the C. Graham Manufacturing Company. He'd been working with different grocery wholesalers and different business people in Asheville, which in the 1880s was a very, very small mountain town in western North Carolina, maybe about 2,000 people population, but it was growing. And when the railroad came, then it really grew. One of those connections was C.E. Graham, who was also a young, mid-20s at this point, entrepreneur himself. And C.E. Graham secures this $50,000 investment in his company. By all accounts, the company did fairly well, though by 1892, there's an economic depression and Moses Cone takes over the company at that point. Asheville cotton mills, even though it's the first investment they make in textiles as the Cone family, they're very quick to start entering this market.
Of course, all industry developed in New England was on account of they were close to water, transportation, and power. As soon as steam power came along and you could transport it with wires, electricity, the South started flourishing. And the textile industry had practically, for all intents and purposes, left New England, and the South had taken over.
Textile mills in the South started to dominate after the Civil War around better access to energy, transportation, raw materials, and an untapped labor force that was financially stressed. From 1865 to 1915, North Carolina textile mills grew from 60 to 318.
What's interesting about textiles is that it's an industry, certainly into the mid and late 20s, made up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very small firms for the most part.
Usually you think of industrialization as occurring in cities, industrial centers. But the textile culture followed the railroads, and it was a dream, an American exceptional dream, that unlike Europe, we would have an industrialization that every small town would have its own mill. It would be spread out. There would be trees around the factories. And as people built these towns, they had this concept, this Jeffersonian ideal of an agrarian America. And some of the mills, when they were first laid out in the mill towns, reflect that notion. There's cute little houses. They tried to make them efficient, but they tried to make them attractive. And they put stores, and they built communities, and they built churches, and they put little shops. And it was really a very pleasant concept. And in the early days, it was often a place that people wanted to live, because it was so much more attractive than anywhere else you could live in a poor area of North Carolina in the late Reconstruction.
Sort of growing poverty and hardship on the land begins to force larger and larger numbers of families out of the countryside and into those new industrial centers. Merchants were also very eager to push these farmers out of semi-subsistence into the marketplace. And one of the ways they did that was with passage of fence laws. The laws now required that animals be fenced, and that's devastating for people who are living a semi-subsistent way of life. If you fence your animals, you have to feed them. You can't just turn them loose in the woods to fend for themselves, which means that you then now have to go back to the merchant and take out larger loans at those very high interest rates. And of course, you combine that then with the requirement that you grow a cash crop, cotton or tobacco, in order to be able to pay those loans back. Well, as you're doing that, you're paying less and less food for yourself. You borrow more. And as you produce more and more cotton and tobacco, it's basic economics. As more of those commodities enters the market, prices plummet.
My father came from Brown Summit to work in the Cone mills.
And my grandfather came to the mill villages from Moore County to work. He came off a farm to work.
Times were hard. I mean, in the mountains in particular, in the foothills of Appalachia, people knew hunger. And so when a recruiter would come from the mills, and often there was a recruiter who would come to a church or a community and say, now you all come down and work in the mills. Whole families moved. It wasn't a migration of men. It was whole families that would go down into the mills. Think of it, running water. In some cases, electricity. I mean, for these people, this was a major change in their lives, to be able to live in a community with other people, to have a church that was much larger, to have stores.
Many of whom looked at textile employment as a kind of stopgap measure. They would go to the mill, they would earn some hard cash, and the idea is that they would come back and reestablish themselves on the land. And in fact, in some families, you would have even seen a division of labor early on that reflected those hopes. Women and children going to work in the mill, the husband staying home to plow the land, tend a crop, and bring it in. The reality at the end of the day for these families is almost none of them were able to return. There was no going back, and they were part of a growing population who began to refer to themselves as cotton mill people, who were defined by this new kind of employment. So when people came off the land, they came to live and work in a company-owned mill village. Early on, these mill villages were built by mill owners as a matter of necessity. Early mills were located out in the countryside. And of course, if you were going to build an industry in that setting, you had no choice but to provide housing. There was nothing otherwise for these families to relocate and live in. What is interesting about the textile industry is that a larger percentage of the workers here in this industry lived in a factory-owned town, about 92%. So that's the highest percentage for any industrial workforce in the country.
When farmers moved into the mills, they gave up independence. I mean, the whole dream had been to own their own land, stand on their own 2 feet, and as a male, to provide for your family. The only thing really you fought against was nature. And all of that control is lost when you're working for somebody else. And when you're living in the man's house who you work for, you've lost that independence.
My folks bought a defunct Carolina Steel and Iron Company, several thousand acres, northeast of Greensboro. And they built a plant there, and they built their home there.
In 1895, after investing in other southern mills, the Cones built their first textile mill, Proximity, containing 250 looms in Greensboro, North Carolina. The new mill was called Proximity in recognition of its geographical closeness to the cotton fields.
The old Massachusetts cotton mills were the biggest operators in denims, and I believe our folks tried to encourage some denim manufacture in the South and weren't able to get any of the mills to go on denims. It was a case of a big investment in an indigo machine, and that's one reason that our people decided to go at their own in building a mill down in the South to make denims. That was our first mill here in Greensboro. $10% of this money was put up by the Dukes. The Dukes were trying to encourage development. They had just started in the power business, and they recognized in order to have a viable power operation, they needed some wholesale customers, manufacturing customers. We built the second mill here in Greensboro, and in this flannel mill, the Revolution Mill, which is built in Greensboro. We interested the Sternberger family down in South Carolina, who were merchants down there, and our people knew them, to invest in a mill here in Greensboro, along with some of our capital, the Cone capital.
With funding from a Baltimore bank, the Cones opened their third mill, the White Oak Plant, in 1905. The White Oak Mill became the largest denim manufacturing plant in the world.
You knew what time it was by the whistle blowing.
Would time your day by the Mill Village whistle going off. They had 15 minutes to get to work when the first whistle went off, and then they had to be there at the second.
My dad was known as a beamer.
My father, he started off as a truck driver.
My father worked in the dye house. I ran 79 machines, carding machines.
Daddy was a loom fixer.
Daddy was a doffer, and Mother, I guess, worked in the spinning room.
My mother was a weaver.
I just worked 53 years in the plant.
It was our parents and my grandparents who worked in the mills, who worked very hard and under sometimes not good conditions. And, you know, people went to work at 13 and 9 and 10.
The work at the mill was not easy. The working conditions weren't that good at that time because they didn't have air conditioning in the mills.
You know, they just didn't pay people a whole lot. They paid you enough to have one of those houses and to do a couple of other things. But if you planned on having more than one car or having an adequate number of bedrooms for your children or to be able to take a vacation or to be able to send your kids to college, you're going to have a better wage than what you were earning there.
The Cone Mills were more than just a place to work, but also a place to live and raise a family. Four villages surrounded the Cone textile mills, named after each plant: Proximity, Revolution, and White Oak. A segregated village, East White Oak, housed the black workers.
When I was doing my employment, to run a piece of equipment was a big improvement over conditions when my grandfather worked there or when my father was there. They did manual work. Blacks didn't run any equipment.
The houses were built just about the same, 4 basic rooms plus the bathroom, but a lot of the houses in East White Oak did not. They had a bathroom, but no bathtub.
Most Mill Village families maintained their farming skills by keeping small gardens and fruit trees to supplement their incomes. Nearby pastures were provided to raise livestock.
And he always had raised meat and chickens, which you could have in your backyard. And we could have hogs over where the pens were for them. They weren't around the house.
The Cone Corporation provided recreation centers, schools, and company stores for the communities. They also helped to build the community churches.
It was fun. It was fun growing up. I mean, we had social outlets.
Cone had set up 3 YMCAs. It was White Oak YMCA, Proximity YMCA, and East White Oak YMCA.
We had dances, we had movies, we had parties, we had little recreation clubs.
And they had lots of things for the children. They had sewing classes for the girls, and they had clubs for the boys.
A local
baseball team called the Textile Giants. They were very good.
They had Camp Hermann.
The camp that we would go to in the summertime and spend a week, and that was really a neat experience. That big lake, and we learned boating, and we learned lots of things.
They had picnics every July. They sponsored picnics for the families. They did a lot, and it was a lot of fun.
The company stores they had a company store in each one of the villages, White Oak, Proximity, and Revolution. They had, and there was one in Printworks also. And the company store is just like the song, you owe your soul to the company store. If you needed something, you go to the company store, and then they'd put it on your tab.
You bought your furniture, your groceries, your meat, your cloth, your clothes, your shoes. You could buy everything. It was a mercantile.
And then the problem was, if you spent more than you made, you really got in trouble. And sometimes people did that.
It was a close-knit community. Everybody knew everybody.
You can see the oneness of people who worked together, went to church together, lived together, walked the same streets. And it was a village. It really was a large village.
If someone was sick or was out of work for a period of time, we would take up canned goods and take up money to contribute to their livelihood until they can get back on their feet.
We had our own separate identities. There's boundaries in the neighborhood.
The men or the young guys didn't even allow other fellows to come in the community to date the girls because they were very protective of. And as a matter of fact, most of the men in this community married the women in this community.
Most of the parents here wanted more for their children than they had for themselves.
You know, we didn't have any money, but we definitely weren't poor.
It doesn't mean that you don't have what you need. It just means you don't have the extras. We had enough to eat. We had love. We had what we needed to function. I think a lot of people hear poor and just think greatly deprived, and that's not how it was.
While mill children often have fond memories of growing up in the villages and taking advantage of the many community amenities, the working conditions in the mills and the workers' relationship with their employers were complex.
So the men, as they set up villages, were not only doing it out of economic necessity and social control, but many of these men really thought that this was the moral way to run industry, to really care about their workers and to have this benevolent society.
There were a lot of services right there in the community, so we didn't have to leave a lot for very many things.
They had everything. They had doctors in the neighborhood, they had dentists in the neighborhood, they had social workers in the neighborhood. The teachers, they paid an extra month's pay so that they could get the good teachers to come teach at Proximity and Cesar Cone.
They furnished water, lights, garbage pickup.
We didn't even have to cut our own shrubbery.
Dry cleaner, shoe shop, post office, hotel, and the buildings were gorgeous.
They made sure at Christmas time nobody went without meat for their table at Christmas time. They'd put a ham on the porch at everybody's house at Christmas time.
I tell people now about what we had, the swimming and all the things that they provided. They said, well, that sounds like you lived in a country club.
So really, from the point of view of the workers, the early mill village, while paternalistic, was a wonderful place to live. But there's always the trick, which is if Daddy is giving you your privileges, Daddy can take them away.
And of course that gave an employer extraordinary authority over some of the most intimate details of people's lives. If you can imagine, if you're fired on the job or you're disciplined on the job, if you're fired, you have nowhere to live. You've not only lost your job, but you and your family are literally on the street. So people begin to experience there a sort of intrusive authority.
It's really a social contract. The workers get benefits. They are cared for in a world in which they have almost no rights. They get running water and they get housing. They have someone to go to if there's an injustice. And in the earliest days, it was personal. The paternalist father walked through the mills and often knew people by name or knew the families. We have to remember that paternalism is the way people lived. They might not have had the word, but they understood it and they shaped it from both sides. And we should never forget that it was an intensely human relationship of real people that loved and fought and created families and changed America.
During the early part of the 20th century, the Cones operated their textile mills in a similar manner to other textile mills during that era. Their response to the prevailing social issues of the day were very much in line with other industrialists regarding labor issues such as union pressures for better wages and working conditions, and the handling of race relations.
Pressures came from unions for salaries, more money, so we decided, heck with it. Looks like we're gonna have to give it to them in the payroll. So to heck with it, we just get out of it as far as this paternalism is concerned.
The Cones were very successful in Greensboro, and during the 20th century expanded their plants throughout the South. The Cone family would amass a great wealth from manufacturing denim. If you should be lucky enough to become wealthy in that distant land, do not let it make you proud and overbearing. Do not think that your energy and knowledge accumulated that wealth, but God gave it to you to use for the best purpose and for charity. Do not forget that you are also under obligation to assist your relatives and to help them get ahead. Like many successful industrialists, the Cones were active philanthropists, giving back to communities both locally and nationally. One particular act of generosity that stands out in collective memory is the rescue of the Greensboro textile branch of the NC Bank and Trust.
In the Depression, Cone Credit Union, that nobody lost a dime. They made good every penny that you put in there.
Of Herman and Helen's 13 children, they had 10 boys and 3 girls. One son died at 3 months of age in Jonesboro. Of the 12 surviving children, 8 would work for the family company. Because half of the Cone children never married or were childless, a significant portion of the Cone fortune and denim dollars are now in public hands, with the family's contribution to a community regional hospital, a federal park, and a remarkable art collection.
Moses and his brother both knew a little about the territory in the area around Blowing Rock. They had been traveling sort of salesmen. I think Blowing Rock, was on the verge of becoming a real tourist destination for not the wealthiest people, but people who had been successful.
Moses started purchasing land in the Blowing Rock area in about 1890. And at that point, there wasn't just one big tract of land that was available for sale. So he was going to individual farmers and different people to acquire their property so he could then end up with the 3,600 acres that's now Flat Top Manor and the Moses Cone Estate today.
As soon as they started to bring the property together, Moses had this idea of what the estate would be, and it was definitely going to be a working farm. And this was classic for these late 19th century, early 20th century industrialists, that they were sort of a hobby farm, but it had to be working. And it was also going to be progressive. And so really the idea would be to model a farm for the local folks. And he needed help, right? Because you can't do this all by himself. He hired many local people.
Well, part of the advantage of buying up this land as smaller tracts that used to be individual farms, there were already structures on some of these tracts. There were already families living there. So many of these families turned over and became employees of the Cones, with over 31 different families at one point working here as employees of the Cones. I think that the 26 miles of carriage trails here at Flat Top Manor really show that recreation and being outdoors was important to the Cones. They had apple orchards and a dairy farm. They had all kinds of different gardens for vegetables and flowers. They wanted to be a self-sustaining estate so that it could actually pay for itself. I can't imagine building a house like this and not being able to enjoy it, but Moses did die unexpectedly at the age of 51 in 1908.
Moses had found out that one of his close employees had been possibly embezzling from him and probably already had a heart condition. The stress of that embezzlement and just the fact that he had this heart condition led to his really early death. Bertha was, extremely distraught by this because it seems like they had been partners in about everything.
But after Moses passed away unexpectedly, she was sort of faced with this huge estate that she was now in charge of managing and running.
When Moses died, the apple trees were just maturing, so she was really the one that began to, have enough produce to sell commercially. So she really took it to the next level. Moses had done some research on sheep, but she continued that and then brought in different breeds of sheep, and again, is sort of a model to what people could do in this area in terms of diversifying what they did in terms of farming.
Bertha Cone died in 1947, outliving Moses by 39 years. Bertha and Moses were childless, and the Flat Top Manor was left to the Moses H. Cone Memorial Hospital Fund to honor Moses's legacy. The hospital, unable to maintain the vast property, turned the estate over to the National Park Service as part of the surrounding Blue Ridge Parkway.
Moses, he died without a will. So under the laws of intestacy, his wife inherited half of his personal property. So she set up this hospital, retaining her interest in her husband's estate for life.
Upon Bertha's death, with funds from her estate and the generous contributions of Moses' siblings, construction of the hospital began. The hospital opened in 1953.
It was custom for brothers to support unmarried sisters. Moses and then Caesar in particular were very supportive of their two unmarried sisters.
The Cone sisters, Clarabelle and Etta, amassed one of the greatest private collections of contemporary art. The collection contained over 3,000 pieces of art, including 500 works by Matisse and over 100 works by Picasso. The Cone sisters were unique individuals. Clarabelle Cone was intellectual and confident. She was part of the first generation of female doctors in this country. Etta, the younger sister, was very warm, kind, and generous, and took care of her parents, Hermann and Helen, in their later years. Etta made the first purchase of art in 1898 and bought most of the works in the collection.
Etta and Clarabelle first went abroad. They met Leo and Gertrude Stein, who were old family friends. The acquisition of artworks really started when Gertrude Stein thought that her friends from Baltimore, who had more money than she did, might be interested in buying some of Picasso's works to help him feed himself and his girlfriend. Picasso was completely unknown. He was a starving Spaniard. Cone sisters started to buy lots of drawings for very little money. I mean, they cost almost nothing, but at the time, that was important for Picasso to be getting any francs for his next meal. Gertrude Stein also introduced them to Matisse. The Cone sisters both gravitated to Matisse's work as well as Picasso's work. The Cone sisters were frankly considered crazy for spending money on these artworks. I think it's a credit that the brothers never said, wait a minute, we're not going to support you if you put your money into these crazy paintings.
During the last half of the 19th century, the textile mills helped catapult the U.S. into becoming the largest industrialized nation in the world. For nearly a century, several generations of North Carolinians depended on the textile industry for their livelihoods. By the 1920s, 15% of Greensboro's population worked for the Cone Mills Corporation, creating stability to the region and wealth to the family.
But let's remember that every developing country, when it first begins to industrialize, usually turns to textiles. And one of the reasons is it's very low wage, very low investment compared to high-tech industries. So textile industries are almost always one of the first waves of industrialization you'll see in any developing country. And after the Civil War, the South was a developing country.
Work in the mills was tough.
They complained about their working conditions daily. It was too hot, it was dirty, it was hard. But it was a job. So it was a way of life. And we recognized the good and the bad about that.
The results were good.
My daddy was very proud of his work. He would look, he's got blue jeans on.
I think the Cone mills and the Cone family played a major role in the development of the city of Greensboro.
They had a very broad network of family members or business associates they knew through their Jewish community connections. And this is one reason why not just the Cones, but other businessmen that were Jewish in the South really succeeded well in small communities, because they could tap into this very much larger worldwide market.
A story that in some ways is over. Most of the factories are gone. It's easy to say that this is just simply commemorative and that's a time that has passed. But I think it's also worth thinking about lessons for the next round of industry and the next set of factors that drive our economy. What does an employer owe its employees? How do the employees build community and connection to a sense of place? How do they handle the transitions as the economy shifts? What's inevitable? This is the way the world works. The economy changes, and what's preventable? Should it have been different? Sometimes history can be a useful vantage point through which you can wrestle with these questions that are still very much around.
In the early part of the 21st century, the assets of the Cone Mills Corporation and Burlington Industries were acquired to form the International Textile Group. White Oak Mill is still manufacturing cone denim and employs several hundred workers. Today, the visitors of the Moses Cone Memorial Park, the Moses Cone Hospital, and the Baltimore Museum of Art are reminded of the legacy of the Cone family and the Cone Mill workers.